Okay, maybe first you run an audio test. Is this okay? Is the audio coming through loud and clear? Marvelous. Okay, I'll start talking. Well, everybody, I am Herb Murez, and I first of all want to express my thanks for being given the honor of addressing the assembly here, and it is a very important occasion, and I am honored and I thank you. And I want to tell you about myself. That's very informative about the times that we live in. I was born in Vienna, in Austria, on July 2nd, 1923. That makes me 97, not quite 98 years old. And I look back upon my life, and if I have learned anything, I like to pass it on. I went to school. I was born in Vienna. My parents were middle-class people. They had a shoe store, and I went to school, and it was a school system very much unlike any that we have here. You got fed a tremendous amount of data, and you had to learn a lot of things, but you had to learn them by rote. Nobody tried to encourage a student to do any critical thinking on his or her own. It just was an exception rather than the run of the mill. And I do remember I had one teacher who taught history, and he was an exception, and he happened to have been a Jewish teacher who was expelled immediately when Austria was annexed by Germany. And he said, I don't care if you remember the date of a particular battle or where it occurred. What I want you to understand is the forces that were at work, the forces that were in favor or opposing something, and how they came out and how the conflict resolved itself ultimately, how history is affected. So he was an exception, and I pay homage to him for giving me a lifetime interest in history and how history develops, not just remembering dates, places of battles, but the forces that shape the events. Well, anyway, I went to school, and as I said, it was a school system that did not encourage a lot of, or any independent critical thinking. And I was, by nature, primarily, I'm somewhat unaccepting of authority, or just because somebody handed down something to me to accept it and go with it. That's not my nature, so I didn't do too well in school, and but I made it, I passed it. And let me tell you about how things were in Austria when I went to school. There was a fair amount of unemployment. Austria was a remnant state after the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had something like 56 million inhabitants, and when Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Bosnia and Herzegovina and a lot of the Baltic countries were separated to set up their own governments. All that remained was Austria, with a population of around 6 million people, of which 2 million lived in Vienna. So Vienna was a big head with a small body. And times were tough. There was a lot of unemployment, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction with conditions, as there always are when, say, when times are bad. And of course, when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, almost immediately they started to instigate the dissatisfaction and what you might call, what was called at the time, an illegal party of people who were supportive of Nazism, and they were being ready to support any annexation by Germany when it would come. In 1938, it did come. Germany at that point felt strong enough to defy the English, French, and Italian governments to instigate an annexation of Austria, and it happened. And it was a very drastic turnaround. Austria, thank you, Rabbi, thank you. Austria, you must remember, was not under the Nazi government in 1933. So while there was a certain amount of anti-Semitism, it was not official government policy. In Germany, during this time, the persecutions started gradually and they increased incrementally, by year, by month, and what have you. So by the time what got to be March of 1938, persecution and Nazism was pretty well established in Germany and well advanced. And at that point, Austria was taken over. And what happened in Germany over the space of 5 years happened in Austria in 2 months. And the first thing that happened, the Jewish students in school were first segregated, and they had to sit separately. You couldn't mix with the whole student population. And shortly after that, in May of 1938, all Jews were simply thrown out of school. No Jewish student was allowed to attend any school except a Jewish school, of which there was only one in Vienna, and that was already full. And one thing was obvious at that point, that there was no future in Austria for my family, for any other Jew, or for that matter, anybody who disagreed with Nazism. Nazism was a deification of Adolf Hitler, who was the Führer and the leader and the supreme authority for everything. It was an authoritarianism carried to the utmost. And the people thought things would be better. And they figured that being part of the German Reich, things would be better. And for a while, they actually were, or so they were led to believe. There's a biography of Adolf Hitler. It's available through Amazon, which I think is the authoritative biography. If anybody is interested in working their way through about 800 and some odd pages and 200 pages of bibliography, I recommend it. it's the authority, it is authoritative and probably the scholars review. The author, whose name escapes me at the moment, Peter something, is actually a German historian who works at an English university, and I think only a German could do this kind of historical research, because there's a language problem for anybody else who is not fluent in German and knows not only the German language as such, but also all the ongoings and how they resulted in specific terminology and expressions and so forth. Anyway, let me get back to the point. We were thrown out of school. My brother, I had a brother who was 3 years older than I, and we were thrown out of school, and it was obvious to my parents that everybody had to get out, and being good parents that they were, they figured first let's get the children out. And I should tell you now what happened to my parents. As I said earlier, they had a shoe store, lived a perhaps middle class, fairly dignified kind of lifestyle, and all of that changed rapidly. For one thing, there were some roving gangs. As I mentioned earlier, there were a number of unemployed people, homeless people, and when the Anschluss, which is the takeover by Germany, when that happened, they just put on red armbands with the swastika on it, and they said, and they roved around and see what they can pick up in the way of Jewish property. So several came to our house to try to search and see what they could find and lift, and it was simply not peaceful anymore. You were not safe in your own apartment. And so far as my parents' business was concerned, the Germans had a system of cleansing Jews of their property, if they had any. So my parents had a shoe store. It was a big shoe store, and a very nice place, and had a good business and a good customer base. And the Nazi Party designated a purchaser whom they deemed deserving. He was one of those illegal activists during the time between 1933 and 38, advancing the Nazi cause to facilitate Germany's takeover. He was designated the buyer. And my father was told that the business was in his name, and the store, the rent was in his name, or everything. He was simply told he had to sell. And he had to sell for approximately 5% of the fair market value of the store. Because immediately at the takeover, the Nazis had a system where when the store was Jewish owned, they smeared up the windows with white paint or soap or something like that, and wrote Jew, Jude, as a warning that no non-Jewish person should enter the store. And in some instances, including my parents, they even put a guard in front of the store so nobody should enter without being warned that this is a Jewish store and you're being observed in patronizing a Jew. Well, anyway, my father was told he had to sign an agreement, was drawn up in very legalistic form by an attorney that was designated by the Nazi Party, who drew up an agreement. And according to that agreement, as I said, the store was sold to this designated buyer from the Nazi Party for approximately 5% of its value. And it wasn't paid in cash to my father. It was paid in installments. And it wasn't paid in installments to him or to my mother, but it was paid in installments into a blocked account. And later on, towards the end of 1938, they levied a tax on all these blocked accounts, so as punishment for the events that led up to the Kristallnacht, of which I will speak presently, and the account was wiped out. So it was a takeover, but it was disguised with pseudo-legalistic formalities. And my father suffered a nervous breakdown and became totally dysfunctional. And my mother carried everything on, and she saw to it that my brother could get out, and that I could get out, and that ultimately my parents could get out. To get out at that point involved two specific requirements. First of all, the Nazis had to let you out, and they wouldn't do that until they were satisfied you were cleansed of anything really valuable. Second, you had to have a place to get in, and there was a problem with that, because most countries cried big crocodile's tears. We feel so sorry for the persecuted people, but we have an unemployment problem of our own, that we need to feed our own people, so we cannot admit anybody. The United States had an immigration program at that time that allowed for annual immigration by people, but there was a quota for every country based upon the people within the United States population that hailed from that part of the world. So for example, there was a big quota for England and Scotland and Ireland, because perhaps the biggest slice of the American population at that time had that type of ancestry. There was a smaller quota for example, Poland and for Russia, and those are the people that at that time fell under these quotas. Like my parents had been born in what was then Hungary, Austria, but then became Poland, so they fell under the Polish quota, and that one filled up very rapidly, and they had to wait. First of all, my mother saw to it that immediately we went to the American consulate and registered and got a quota number. And my brother and I got quota numbers, and my parents got quota numbers. But then there was another requirement for immigrating into the United States, which is an American citizen had to file what was known as an affidavit with the Immigration Service, undertaking that the immigrant sponsored by the affiant would not become a public charge. So you had to find somebody who would give you an affidavit. And many many American Jews gave as many as they possibly could, and some, I hate to tell you, did not. But that's it always in life when good deeds have to be done, somebody will step forward and somebody will step backwards. That's life. Anyway, my brother got an affidavit from a very distant relative of a relative in Chicago, and he got out by about a month before I did, and I managed to get out in March of 1939. But before I managed to get out, I have to tell you an experience that he had, an experience that I had. As I said, there were roving gangs of people who just picked on the Jews in Vienna. And one of them caught my brother, and they made him clean part of the street with a toothbrush. That was one of their favorite tricks. They compelled them to actually kneel down with a toothbrush and clean the sidewalk. In November of 1938, I was the youngest, so it was my job to go through all of the offices. As a youngster, I was less exposed to overt attacks, physical attacks, than adults were, or older children were. And anyway, I had to go to an office to get a paper because, as I said earlier, they had a system to cleanse you of all properties, and everything had a veneer of pseudo-legality, but it had to be pursued. So I went to that office, and usually it was in the center of Vienna, the very oldest part of Vienna, where the street was perhaps 7-8 feet wide, just an alley, barely an alley. And normally there were people milling around because they had business in this office. And I get there in the early morning, and by the time I'm in there, the street is empty, and there was an SS guard at the entrance. It was a sort of a blind alley, and this just didn't seem right to me. This didn't smell safe. So I looked around and I asked that SS man, "Excuse me, sir, where is this particular office?" Well, he didn't answer me. He asked me, "How old are you?" So this didn't make me feel any safer. And I was 14 at the time, and I told him, "I'm 13. And at that point, somebody called out to him from one of the windows, and he turned his head. And instinctively, I can't say that this was a deliberate act, but instinctively, I ran. I ran as far as I could and as fast as I could through the narrow streets and alleys in that part of town. And when I was finally exhausted to where I had to stop, I looked around and nobody was following me. And I very carefully made my way back home, and I found out what had happened. That it was after the so-called Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, which is something that the Nazi engineered. There was an event that took place in Paris where a Jewish emigre, a man who was mentally disturbed, took a gun and took a pot shot at some third secretary of the German legation. Didn't do much harm, but the Nazis used that as a pretext to engineer public outcry, public acts of being offended and outraged. And the Nazi gangs were going around, and where there was any Jewish property or Jewish store, the windows were broken and with glass all over. That's why it got to be known as the Night of the Broken Glass. And much later, I learned that the same thing happened to synagogues and Jewish community organizations and even Jewish-owned housing. And I learned years later, and I will come to that, that the Nazi Party had given directions to the fire department, let it burn down, just protect adjacent Aryan property. I saw this in writing much later, and I'll come to that. Anyway, I did manage, I said, to get my exit visa from when my quota number was up, and my mother took me to the railway station so I could leave, and she was much concerned, not so much with herself, but with me. So she acted like I was going on a summer vacation to make it easier for me to get. And I got onto the train. Of course, I had a suitcase. I was allowed to take one suitcase only. They didn't have the suitcases with wheels at the time. You had to hand carry them. So I had a suitcase I could hand carry that had a few clothing in it, and that's about it. So, and I had my passport with my visa with it, and the passport, which I still have, it's an interesting document because it had a big red J stepped on the title page, and it read that it was valid only for a one-time exit from the German Reich. That's it. Anyway, I got onto the train, and the train went out of the Austrian territory into the Rhineland, and then came to the Dutch border, and that was before Holland was occupied by Germany, and there was still a functioning Dutch border guard as well as the German border guard. And the German border guard, they came into the compartment. Let's see your papers. So I showed them my papers, and wait here. The men took off, and I think it took them about 20 minutes to come back, and that 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. But he did come back, he threw the passport at me, says, okay, you may leave. And he looked through the suitcase, upset everything, went through it, made sure I didn't have any jewelry or anything, and then went over to the Dutch side, through the train, sort of crossed the border, and the Dutch border guards were much friendlier. Said, the Germans let you out, you must be okay, go ahead, go in peace. The train actually came right up to the dock, so I had to get out of the train and onto a ship. And there was the SS something or other, a Dutch ship of 10,000 tons that was going back and forth between the Dutch harbor of Vlissingen and New York. So it took that ship 10 days to cross the Atlantic and to get into New York. In New York, I was met first by a representative of HIAS, which is HIAS is an acronym for Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and I had a very distant relative in New York, a very retired lady who was living in a basement apartment and who had a pension that just barely allowed her to live and eat. But she took me in for a few days, and because I had a ticket for the Greyhound bus to go to Los Angeles. And I spent a couple of days in New York, and I had another relative in New York, a fellow by the name of Marco. They were relatives on my mother's side. And Mr. Marco was sort of had a double life. During the day, he had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. In the evening, he went down to the Bowery where he had a bunch of rental properties and collected his rents. So he did invite me to come up to his office, and he spoke to me for 5 minutes, and then he took me back down, put a nickel into the slot for the underground. It was a nickel at the time to fight on the underground to take a subway. I think the price right now is about $2.50. That's the inflation occurred in the meantime. Anyway, I tried to call him, and I could never get through to him after that. I could never get through to him. And anyway, so I went down to the Greyhound station and took the Greyhound bus from New York to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, I was met at the Greyhound station by my Uncle Ted, whom my mother had located and who had executed this affidavit that I had spoken of, that I would not become a public charge. Well, when I called him Uncle Ted, I'm actually sort of rounding out the story a little bit. The relationship was a distant one. He was his wife, Fanny, was the daughter of a lady who had emigrated from Poland, from Galicia, and who was a widow that had children of her first marriage, remarried my father, who had children of his first marriage, so there was no blood relationship then at all, but they had grown up together. So they knew each other, and there was a friendly feeling between them, and that's how Uncle Ted gave me the affidavit. And Uncle Ted had a factory in downtown Los Angeles where he made various garments, and I think I came in on a Friday. And on Monday, he took me down to the factory, and this is where you go to work. If this happened today, I would have to go to school. The requirement existed at the time, but it wasn't enforced. So today it would be probably, but he gave me a job in the shipping department of wrapping up clothes and packing them, and had to push them into a cart and carry them to the department stores in the downtown Broadway. Anyway, he paid me $10 a week, and he took out $5 for room and board, for which I was very thankful, because I didn't have the feeling that I was freelancing, I was sponging. I thought I was paying my way. So I didn't go to school. So I worked at Uncle Ted's place. Eventually I learned something about the garment business, how to cut garments, and I went on to other jobs, and I will fast forward now to skip a lot of stuff, and I will talk to you what happened to me when my parents came. We find that's a whole other story how they got out. I think they were on one of the last flights out of Austria that could land in England when England allowed a limited number of people to come in, not work. They had to be supported by the English Jewish community, but they could wait for their quota numbers to come up so they could come to the United States anyway. First my mother came, and then my father, and I got a letter. It was after Pearl Harbor. I got a letter. Greetings, come on down. So they took a look at me. And they didn't want me for the army because I had flat feet. Didn't take much long after that for another letter to come, so I came down again and I had another medical examination. Flat feet, rejected. The third time, this was all within the space of months. The third time, a letter came, I went down, and the feet weren't flat enough, so accepted. And I went into basic training, and I was actually sent first to a signal corps school, and one fine day, the company clerk called me down, Murez, come on down. And they stuck me on a bus, not even a truck, and the truck went down to the local courthouse in Neosho, Missouri, and the judge said, raise your right hand. So I raised my right hand. Congratulations, you're now a citizen. Back he went. So my certificate of naturalization shows me grimy army fatigues. And not another week passed, but the company clerk called me again, Murez, come on down. You're being transferred to Cambridge, Maryland. Cambridge, Maryland was the U.S. Army's intelligence school. And now I should mention something about military intelligence. It has nothing to do with intelligence. Take my word for it, it doesn't. But the term derives for an older usage where intelligence meant information, particularly information about an adversary. And in that school, we had set up like actual classes. We learned about the organization and structure of the Nazi Party and the German army, and techniques for interviewing German army prisoners, and how to analyze German army documents for any usefulness. And I went through that course, and then they sent me overseas. And I went overseas on a ship that, believe it or not, that carried 25,000 people, all soldiers going to Europe. The ship was, during peacetime, it was the SS Normandy, which was the French equivalent to the Queen Mary, that had been cleaned out of all of the insides and had nothing but bunks, decks, mess facilities, and that's it. So that ship was supposed to travel from Baltimore into Bristol, which is in southern England, Actually, the ship landed in Liverpool, which is further north in Scotland, because they were running low on fuel. They were out of fuel because they had to evade some U-boats, but that ship relied on speed rather than armaments or protection by warships. So, at that point, I will have to skip a lot of the details. I did wind up in a unit that worked to analyze German army documents and military documents. Among other things, we had retrieved records of the Nazi Party because during the waning days of the Nazi Reich, they dumped all of the records into a salt mine, an old salt mines. I thought that would destroy them. Well, it didn't, because some Navy SEALs pulled them up. They were all waterlogged and partially illegible, and of course they were on maybe equivalent of about 9 by 12 file cards. And we had organized a group of German people to sort them out and alphabetize them, and I had a job of supervising that crew, make sure that they don't destroy anything that we were interested in. And we actually did rebuild the records of the Nazi Party. That was useful for the occupation, because at no time ever have I met a German, I had to talk to a lot of them, that said they had any knowledge of what had been going on. We didn't know anything about the concentration camp. We had nothing to do with it. That was all kept secret. And among the papers that we had was articles in the newspaper published by the Nazi Party, known as the Völkische Beobachter, that told the story. It was widely distributed, and newspapers at that time, remember, were the principal ways of distributing news to the population. Anyway, I went through that, and I also had to translate a lot of documents, among other things, field orders signed by Adolf Hitler himself for the attack on Poland, for the attack on Russia, and among those field orders, there's one that stands out in my mind. The field order that Hitler signed for the reoccupation of the Rhineland. Because under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War, Germany was not allowed to keep troops in the Rhineland. And Hitler was interested in reoccupying the Rhineland as a way of defying what he called the diktat, the compulsion of the Versailles Treaty. So I remember that one that was Hitler's personal signature on it, that said, and that's pretty much of a verbatim translation: if you encounter any resistance on the part of French or Belgian troops, you are not to engage, but to turn around and go back peacefully and quickly to whence you came. Well, if you look at the history of that reoccupation of the Rhineland, the French at the time were ready to mobilize. And they also wanted the English to mobilize and to push the Germans back. Well, the English didn't want to go along because the English had their own problems. I think there was the time of Edward VIII having his problems that upset England very much, and said we have a severe unemployment problem of our own, and the war is over, let them do it. So the French wouldn't go alone, So the French permitted it to happen. And of course, this was a signal for Adolf Hitler that there was not a will to resist. And when you are bullied and you encounter an opponent that has no will to resist, you know what happened? That's history. That's exactly what happened. It happens in an individual case on a schoolyard, and it happens internationally. If one party is intent on bullying, the other one is intent on just backing off. No good. The lesson that I derived from all this is evil must be resisted where it raises its ugly head. It will not go away by itself. It must be resisted. And it must be recognized for what it is. And I like to speak to student groups who don't know that much history, but they do know about bullying. And I can tell them, whatever happens, you must be on the side of what is right, what is decent, what is human. That's where the safety lies. And if I were talking to a student group, I would tell them another thing. Whatever goes on, nowadays it is customary in politics to define your opponent with a label, because that is supposed to either blacklist them or approve them or what have you. So don't look at labels, look at the content. What does the person say? What does he do? What does he stand for? Just by calling him something, that doesn't mean anything. And I am glad to have had this opportunity to speak to you and to tell you we must not forget what happened, because, and I'll close my remarks with that. Have any of you ever been in Washington, D.C. and looked at the National Archives? There's an inscription on the building. What is past is prologue. You learn from the past. If you don't learn, you're going to have to repeat the lesson. And I hope you learned something from the past.